On June 30th, 2025, a liquefied natural gas (LNG) carrier departed from Kitimat Port, British Columbia, carrying not just energy but a geopolitical statement. After more than 3 decades of relying on pipelines through the United States, Canada has officially pivoted, launching a direct export route to Asia. No longer a mere link in Washington's supply chain, Canada is rewriting its role on the global energy map, the first time cutting through the waves. That morning, under the overcast skies of the British Columbia coast, the people of the small town of Kitimat weren't just watching a ship slicing through the sea. They were witnessing a quiet but profound chapter of their country's history. It wasn't a holiday. There were no fireworks, no national anthem echoing in the air. But, in the hearts of many, this was perhaps a moment even more quietly sacred than grand occasions, because it brought hope for something we've long awaited, a truly independent step in economic and energy strategy. The ship carrying Canada's first LNG shipment to Asia was not simply an export trip. It was the culmination of years of contemplation, of tens of thousands of silent workers, and of a country striving to break free from the outsized shadow of its southern neighbor. For over 30 years, 100% of Canada's exported natural gas had to pass through the U.S. pipelines. Stretching across the border once seemed symbols of enduring cooperation, but over time they became symbols of dependence. And every time policies shifted in Washington, under different presidents, amid dizzying political changes, Canada's energy sector was dragged along like a puppet out of control. No one wants to live with the feeling that their livelihood depends on another country's decisions. The drillers, the operations engineers, or the small restaurant owners serving workers at the LNG Canada site in Kitimat, they don't think about geopolitics in academic terms. They only know that every time gas prices drop due to an American tariff strike, another family loses a job, another town falls into silence. They want their government to take concrete steps to escape that vulnerability. And that ship, on that day, was the first move that made people feel Canada is being itself. What's interesting is that the event wasn't loudly praised in international media as an economic victory. It happened quietly, just like the way Canada typically acts. Steadfast, not loud. But that silence carried weight. Because with the first-ever LNG export from Canada directly to Asia, the country is redrawing its strategic map. No longer just a regional gas supplier, Canada is beginning to become a link in the global energy supply chain. And that matters not just to the world, but even more to Canadians themselves, people who need new faith in their country's ability to control its economic destiny. The people don't demand grand narratives about global markets. They need to see concrete impacts in everyday life, stable electricity prices, sustainable jobs, and an economy that doesn't get swept up in foreign rage or uncertainty. That's why, even if it's not splashed across headlines, for many, especially in Western provinces, LNG Canada is not just an industrial project. It is a new symbol of autonomy. For the first time, the country's precious resources are no longer dependent on a single pipeline. For the first time, when a U.S. president announces a 35% tariff on Canadian goods, the energy sector doesn't spiral into panic. And also, for the first time, Asian energy markets, where demand is stable and long-term, are beginning to see Canada differently. As a strategic partner, not just for its abundant supply, but for its stability and transparency. We must not forget that this did not come from luck. It came from real determination of government, business, indigenous communities, and thousands of quiet workers over nearly a decade. And if Canada can stay on this course, scale up, honor its environmental commitments, and continue to put people at the center of energy policy, then that ship won't be the destination, but just the starting point. The beginning of a new chapter, where Canada is not just a nation with resources, but a nation that knows how to use those resources to shape its place, in its own eyes and in the world's. A silent pivot. No sirens, no steel barricades, no statements from the White House. Yet containers are quietly rerouting away from ports like Seattle and Los Angeles, docking instead at Prince Rupert and Vancouver, locations once dismissed as tributaries of North America's trade flow. In that silence, a quiet but profound shift is unfolding, and Canadians, truck drivers, dock workers, prairie farmers, or tech engineers in Waterloo are beginning to feel the new pulse of the economy, no longer instinctively drawn southward. For decades, Canada operated as an extension of the U.S. market, where over 70% of exports had to pass through what was essentially a checkpoint named Washington. People were used to policies shaped in response to America, from softwood lumber tariffs to dairy permits, from auto standards to the USMCA. But in 2025, quiet events, no lengthy news specials, no high-level summits, are creating something unprecedented, a Canada that says no without needing to speak. At Prince Rupert, the deep-water port closest to Asia, container traffic has risen 38% in just the first half of the year. Freight trains no longer stretch endlessly southward, but veer west, connecting to trans-Pacific shipping lanes, headed directly to Busan, Osaka, Guangzhou, or Haiphong. This doesn't just change logistics maps. It changes how Canadians think about their future. Because every shipment that departs Canada without passing through the U.S. is a step toward independence, a test of bargaining power, of national value, and a break from the shadow that has long forced this economy to plead, "Please don't cause conflict." To ordinary people, macro strategies aren't a hot topic, but they understand one thing clearly: the less dependence, the less risk of being held hostage when Washington changes course. Ms. Marisa, who owns a small dry goods store in Richmond, shared, "Before, everything had to come through California. Higher fees, delays, and there was nothing we could do. Now, with ships coming straight to Vancouver, it's faster, more affordable. That means I can keep prices stable for my customers." In Saskatoon, wheat farmers are starting to notice the shift too. Export contracts can now be signed directly with importers in Japan or South Korea, no longer needing middlemen based in Chicago or Minneapolis. "We don't need to ask, 'Will the U.S. approve?' anymore," said Brian, a third-generation farmer. "Now it's, 'If my product is good and the price is fair, we're good to go.'" This adjustment, though not officially declared as a national strategy, is the most practical and powerful response from Canada's people and business in a shifting world. While the U.S. uses tariffs and political pressure to shape trade, Canada, quietly, is reshaping its operating structure, starting with where goods go and how they get there. The big question is, how will the government respond to this shift? Will it invest more in West Coast port infrastructure? Will trade agreements with Asia, like the CPTPP, be fully leveraged? And most importantly, will it listen to the people and businesses already moving ahead of policy? The public isn't asking for a strategy written in academic language. They just want to know that what they're doing, forging their own path, connecting directly with the world, won't be hindered by policies that still treat the U.S. as the center of the universe. They hope the government won't just follow, but walk alongside them on the path to repositioning Canada as a nation independent in energy, supply chains, and geopolitical thinking. Because sometimes the most powerful way to speak is to act in silence. A silent wall at the border. In the sweltering summer days of 2025, residents living near the U.S.-Canada border began sensing a hard-to-name but very real shift. The familiar refrigerated trucks, once full of produce, frozen meat, electronic components, are now thinning out. Small businesses specializing in transshipment, logistics, freight forwarding from Manitoba to North Dakota are sighing because regular orders have dried up. But what worries people most isn't fewer shipments, but the sudden coldness coming from the other side of the border. No official document, no refusal of cooperation announcement, no threats issued by Washington or Ottawa. But within less than 3 months, a slew of transport routes, customs coordination mechanisms, and informal logistics agreements that existed for decades between the two countries have been silently frozen. People have started calling this phenomenon by a simple name: the silent wall. A wall not made of concrete, but made of coldness in phone calls, delays in procedures, and distance in cooperative will. From trust to ruin. For people doing business in border areas, like Elise Tremblay, owner of a small transport company in Quebec that shipped food to New Hampshire, this felt like a slap with no warning. We used to think this was a blood-tied relationship. Two countries growing together, sharing the flow of goods for mutual benefit. But now, calls to the U.S. go unanswered. Emails no longer get replies. They're silent, as if we no longer exist. What Elise called a blood-tied relationship used to be a lifeline in North America's trade structure. Every day, hundreds of thousands of goods moved back and forth between the U.S. and Canada via a seamless mechanism, almost automatic, powered by trust and informal agreements. From information sharing pledges to priority handling of paperwork at border crossings. From daily communication between checkpoints to emergency rerouting when one side had an issue. What made that smooth flow wasn't just laws, it was people, goodwill, and initiative. Now, those things have vanished, and no one is sure they will ever come back. When charts are no longer enough to reassure from Ottawa, economic reports still attempt to maintain an optimistic tone. Canada is growing well. Exports to Asia are surging. Dozens of new agreements signed with Europe and India. But what the federal government doesn't say, and likely doesn't dare say, is that soft severances are quietly happening from the U.S. side, gradually squeezing the economic air out of regions dependent on bilateral trade routes. An unnamed logistics expert shared, "I used to attend quarterly meetings between customs officials from both countries. Now, no more invitations, no more meeting schedules, no explanation whatsoever. This puts small and mid-sized businesses at serious risk because they have no backup plan. Everything is like being switched off by a political button." Real demands from the people. What worries people isn't grand concepts like strategic trust lost or collapse of international logistics mechanisms. What they need to understand and be answered is, why are canceled orders unexplained? Why are familiar procedures changing without any warning? And why, when ordinary citizens need the most practical coordination from government, they only receive dry press statements? Jean-Paul, an apple farmer in Ontario, said bitterly, "We invested a lifetime believing in free flow of goods. No one told us that trust could be drained in a single summer. And now I have to chop down 1/3 of my orchard because there's no outlet." The unanswered question. The government can sign new agreements, expand ocean-bound routes, and partner with distant allies. But people need more than that. They need straight talk from the authorities. What is really happening at the border? And in a world where trade relations can freeze without a shot fired, who will stand up to protect the tangible interests of communities dependent on every container, every customs form, every invisible handshake? When silence becomes strategy, people don't need beautiful assurances. They need solutions, and they need them now. The cost of losing patience. There is something seemingly small but quietly seeping into the lives of people across the country. Delay. Not the kind of delay easily sympathized with, but a sluggish dragging on economic and social decisions, causing people day by day to lose patience, lose direction, and most importantly, lose trust. Ordinary people don't demand that the government change the world overnight. They don't need flowery speeches or reports full of technical jargon. What they need are concrete actions, solutions that can be seen by eye, touched by hand, and shave a few dollars off the end-of-month bill. When gas prices rise continuously for 3 quarters, when the cost of feeding and raising kids consumes half of average income, and when trust in the system is no longer reflected in ballots but only in size at the end of each month, this is no longer a matter of global markets, but a warning bell for any government sitting idle, waiting for a natural correction. The delay in energy infrastructure reform, especially when Canada has the opportunity to redefine its LNG export position, is a clear example. Instead of seizing the moment as the U.S. is drawn into domestic crises, the government still chooses to study more, assess risks, or worse, wait to see if the market self-regulates. Meanwhile, people in British Columbia, strained to pay soaring electricity bills in winter, Alberta farmers must choose between fuel for tractors or seeds for the new season, and small and mid-sized businesses in Ontario are closing one by one because logistics costs are skyrocketing. The cost of delay isn't only measured in money. It is measured by trust eroding day by day. When a government fails to take decisive action amid global volatility, it sends a dangerous message that people's interests can wait. But the reality is, none of us can wait. We can't wait for our children to have enough nutritious meals. We can't wait to keep a job threatened by soaring operating costs. We can't wait to know that our lives will eventually stabilize. If people must learn to adapt, then the government must learn to decide. Don't excuse inaction by saying the global economy is unstable. It is precisely when markets are turbulent that strong policies are needed to steer the course. Don't hesitate to admit past mistakes. In fact, people are willing to forgive those who dare to correct wrongs rather than those who stubbornly cling to error in silence. A powerful educational example is Iceland after the 2008 financial crisis. When the entire banking system collapsed, instead of bailing out banks with taxpayers' money, the government allowed them to fail and focused on restoring social welfare. The result? Their economy not only recovered faster than Western European countries, but also regained public trust, an invisible capital no nation should lose. In an era of climate change, geopolitical competition, and supply chain instability, Canada cannot continue trailing behind other countries in decision-making. It's time for a political system to act like a living organism, responding rapidly to signals from people rather than functioning like a cumbersome machine that waits to be oiled every election. Because people don't expect something distant. They simply need to feel that someone up there is truly listening, truly doing. And that, though simple, is what makes the greatest difference between a government respected and a government forgotten. Transparent institutions, decisive action. In the minds of ordinary working people, nothing is more precious than trust. The trust that once they obey the law, work honestly, and pay taxes fully, the state, as the supreme manager, will stand with them, protect them from injustice, ensure that no one is above the law, and that development is not reserved for a privileged few. But then, sometimes people wonder in confusion, is the law truly fair? Is the government protecting the people or just monitoring them? The truth is, when institutions are shrouded in procedural fog, unchecked power seeks to hide wrongdoing, and interest groups can easily manipulate processes. People don't need a smart state model talked about on television. They need a state that truly acts, listens, and is ready to dismantle invisible barriers to protect the real interests of communities. One of the greatest aspirations today is to build transparent institutions, not only at the central level, but spread to every ward and commune. Transparency doesn't mean publishing lots of dry figures. It begins with action. Is a public investment project easily subject to cost overruns? Can a small local business compete fairly with well-connected conglomerates? Can a citizen access and understand exactly how their local budget is spent? True transparency doesn't lie in slogans, but in mechanisms. Mechanisms that control power. When major decisions must be publicly disclosed to the people, when oversight bodies are not manipulated by those they supervise, and when the press is not strangled by sensitive banned zones, then that is the sign of an institution healing itself. People ask for nothing more than fairness, that if they must obey the law, officials also must be held accountable when they err. That if a small enterprise pays taxes late and is fined, a large company that evades taxes worth hundreds of billions cannot be handled internally. And that when there is criticism, the government listens rather than dismissing it with a cold line of not practical. A progressive institution isn't one without mistakes. It is one with enough mechanisms to recognize errors early, correct them quickly, and take clear responsibility before the public. And that only happens when those in power feel seen regularly, not by superiors, but by the people themselves. In an increasingly complex world, marked by fierce competition, maintaining internal trust becomes as crucial as any trade agreement. A government may not be perfect, but if it is transparent and dares to take responsibility, it can still mobilize national resources and will to overcome challenges. On the contrary, a government that loudly declares strength but allows power to fall into the hands of interest groups and allows public trust to erode will inevitably weaken. People don't need a perfect government. They need a government that knows how to correct itself. They need to see that every wrongful act, at any level, has clear consequences. That truth will not be buried. Dissenting voices will not be silenced, and decent people will not be treated as troublemakers. And ultimately, what people yearn for, not an ideal model on paper, but a sense of real-life peace of mind. That they are not alone, that they can live, work, and hope in a country where the law isn't a display, but protects the righteous from those who abuse power. Institutions aren't a distant concept. They are daily breath, quality of life, and the conscience of the state regarding the fate of each person. If reforms don't begin with transparency, they are just patches. But if they begin with light, even the darkest corners can change. Expanding living space. Challenges and hopes. If you ask citizens of major cities today what the most realistic yet increasingly out-of-reach dream is, it is the dream of a stable, affordable home. A dream that doesn't require lining up like buying the newest iPhone. Housing, which once seemed so ordinary, has now become a brain-teasing problem not only for residents but also for urban authorities. And while every square meter is increasingly treated like a luxury commodity, the real question isn't who will build the next high-rise, but rather, how can people keep their dream of a home, even if it's just a small apartment in the suburbs? For more than a decade, housing has ceased to be just about young people moving out, migrant workers, or new immigrants. It has become a clear bottleneck in urban structure. Urban population growth has outpaced planning. Land prices have skyrocketed well beyond income growth, while social housing projects, which were hoped to be a safety valve, have stalled due to all kinds of legal barriers, low profit margins, lack of clean land, and lack of genuinely committed investors. For citizens, particularly working-class and middle-income groups, the reality is increasingly harsh. Long-term renting, living far from the city center, or cramming into subdivided homes with insufficient light and air. Dreams of a small apartment with a balcony, a private kitchen, and a place to park have become extravagant. Those who once believed that hard work and saving would eventually lead to home ownership are now exhausted as the path to settling down becomes increasingly blurred. In that context, the government cannot simply issue slogans like, "Housing is a basic right." They need to turn slogans into action. Many expect not projects with tens of thousands of high-end units built in the old way, but new, creative, flexible, practical, and inclusive models. For example, in many countries, modular housing, flexible housing, or rent-to-own programs have been implemented to meet genuine housing needs rather than continue serving property speculators. In major cities like Singapore, Seoul, or Helsinki, public housing has been designed not to look temporary or for the poor, but to be long-term, comfortable, and desirable. Vietnam has no shortage of conditions to learn from and adapt these models. What's needed is a real institutional push, reviewing invisible barriers that cause social housing to die on paper, aggressively reallocating public land for projects serving the public interest, and setting up actual, not just paper, preferential credit funds exclusively for those with real housing needs. And don't forget the role of satellite cities and suburban areas. With improving transportation infrastructure, many suburban zones could become ideal places to live, so long as policies prevent those areas from becoming half-urbanized, lacking schools, clinics, markets, and connectivity. People don't need more grand conferences on urban space restructuring. What they need is the feeling that they can realistically dream of buying a home after 5 to 7 years of work. A home with a clear title deed, free of disputes or pending zoning plans. A home that doesn't need to be large, but is enough to be called a haven. And a housing policy with no discrimination, where everyone, whether a laborer, teacher, office worker, or street vendor, has the same right to access housing. The challenge is significant, but hope remains. Every transparent policy decision, every housing project delivered on schedule, every community with schools, daycare, and transportation access forms the foundational bricks of that hope. And within that hope, people continue to dream of a day they can open the door to their own home, not to prove success, but simply to feel that finally they have a place to truly call home. People and the journey to regain trust. Across city streets, from a small cafe corner in the heart of the city to rural markets in border areas, a question quietly echoes in people's hearts: when will our lives truly change? After economic upheavals and waves of policy decisions pouring in from Parliament, ordinary people don't wish for grand outcomes. They simply want to live stably, with dignity, and to be heard. And right now, what they need more than ever is trust. Trust that policies aren't drafted solely for air-conditioned meeting rooms, but will genuinely reach into everyday life. Never before has the gap between policy and life been so stark. People may hear growth numbers, but they also see rising electricity bills, expensive grocery costs, and their children's tuition still burdensome. Doubt doesn't stem from animosity, but from lived experience. Too many promises have failed to materialize. That's why rebuilding trust is not only a moral responsibility of the government, but also a prerequisite for any reform program that seeks success. Trust cannot be built in a day, and certainly not through words alone. People only truly place trust when they feel part of the change process. Let them participate, from the smallest community initiatives to larger socio-economic development programs. There must be transparent feedback channels so people know their voices don't fade into thin air. In many developed countries, trust between people and government is maintained not only through administrative efficiency, but also through consistency in actions. When a policy is announced, it comes with a clear roadmap, specific evaluation milestones, and public accountability. Vietnam cannot continue operating the old way, issuing policies reactively, responding slowly to public feedback, and lacking independent oversight mechanisms. If the government wants people to trust it, it must first be willing to take responsibility. Especially now in the digital age, where connectivity between government and citizens is more possible than ever, building trust can fully rely on digital platforms. There need to be public feedback and contribution platforms, where every citizen, regardless of social class, can comment, critique, or even monitor policy. When people see their opinions carry weight, they stop doubting and begin to engage. However, trust isn't just about policy, it's also about attitude. People are willing to forgive mistakes if they see transparency, humility, and willingness to correct from authorities. But they are less forgiving if they sense indifference, bureaucracy, or worse, decisions driven by vested interests affecting their livelihoods. Every official, at every level, should realize that their attitude today is writing the future of national trust. What's most needed now isn't another 200-page strategy. What's needed is that every policy, no matter how small, must live in reality. A public bus arriving on time can change how people view the transportation system. A clean neighborhood, thanks to effective government-community cooperation, can revive community pride. And a low-income family receiving timely support can spark renewed trust in hundreds of other families. Finally, there's something simple yet profound. People don't demand a perfect government, they only need a decent one. A government that knows how to admit mistakes, correct them, and puts people at the center. When that happens, trust doesn't need campaigning. It arrives naturally, like light reaching places that have never seen dawn. And that is when a country doesn't just grow, but truly becomes strong from its roots.